The 7th of September. Those of you who were watching Friday's edition of Hod Jacob with myself and Nori Hunter from Caledon Radio will know that we suffered some problems with transmission. Now, it seems to have been largely from Nori's side, but there's definitely been a lot of interference on the show for about the last 2 weeks. And that's indicative of the fact that we are being noticed by people who don't particularly like the content. And that is perfectly possible, it's even quite simple actually, to interrupt the flow of a live stream by simply interfering with the radio frequency at the right level. So that's possibly what has happened there, because even moving the car to different locations where normally there would have been very good connectivity, we seem to still be suffering problems with picture from Norrie's location in Drumnadrochit. Anyway, all that aside, I did have a couple of things that I wanted to mention today, in fact 3 of them, and in no particular order. I'd like to talk about the United Nations first of all. Now, you will have heard me and many other people, including Sarah Sawyers and others, bloggers of all kinds on these channels, talk about the importance of the United Nations supporting Scotland's right to self-determination. Now, this is a basic human right which is conferred on all peoples across the world by the United Nations Charter. Now, bear in mind that the United Nations was to some degree set up by the United Kingdom itself as a major contributor to the peaceful settlement, if you like, of Europe, America, and basically the free nations as they were known after World War II. So the UK had a large hand in formulating how the UN should operate. And one of the first things that was agreed was that all peoples had the right to self-determination. But what is self-determination, and what is it that it gives us the right to do? Well, self-determination is the right of a people to decide what and who runs their country. And normally that would be themselves, that would be their own politicians, their own system. And they are given this right by the United Nations, and that has been the case since its formation in 1947, that all of us have the right to decide the future of our own country without other nations attempting to overwhelm us, dominate us, or rule us from abroad. Now, it's difficult for Scotland in particular to argue this, since in 1954 the British state decided, when the United Nations asked them what the political status of Scotland was, to tell a big lie, that Scotland was in a voluntary union, which was entered into voluntarily by the people of Scotland in 1707. But we know that's not true, because there was no vote back then by the people of Scotland to join this new United Kingdom. That never happened. Nobody was asked their opinion of it. And the politicians and worthies of the time who were running Scotland were either bribed or cajoled or threatened into signing this union treaty. Now, what most people don't realise is that as soon as the ink was dry on that treaty, it was promptly torn up, and the treaty was replaced with a set of acts of union, which meant that the treaty that they'd signed was actually null and void. There was no treaty of union. It was just a formality. It was basically a capitulation where Scotland was seen by England to have surrendered itself to English dominion for the rest of its future. But nobody was given the opportunity to voluntarily join the union. These political leaders of the time supposedly voluntarily signed up for the union. But the Acts of Union are the only thing which keep it in place. And the Acts of Union are 2 Acts of Parliament. One in the then Scottish Parliament before it was suspended, and one by the English Parliament, which allegedly meant that we were trapped in the Union forever, even though we never volunteered to join it in the first place. So the upshot of all of this is we've remained in this nebulous, undefined state for all these years until 1954, where the United Nations was forced, because it was looking at self-determination for all peoples as part of its charter, to ask the English state what the constitutional status of Scotland actually was. And the British state said that the Scots had voluntarily joined a union, which created a united kingdom of the two nations. Now, this is all bogus and has largely been cemented in place by an awful lot of propaganda over the years, and for 300 years we have been led to believe that we are part of a union with England that we can't get out of, and that we voluntarily chose to join it, which of course we didn't do. So what we have to do now, and this is why the United Nations is so important, and why the further representations which are to be made to the United Nations shortly on behalf of the people of Scotland by Liberation Scotland and organised through Salvo, are so vitally important. The initial, I think you would say it was an initial statement of intent to have a ruling made or changed so that Scotland's current status would be recognised by the UN as a non-governing state, one which has no power to govern itself. In other words, we are a dependency of the United Kingdom, which is de facto a description of a colony. The United Nations doesn't use the word colony, it just describes non-self-governing territories, and these are usually former colonies or actual colonies of European states which colonised all sorts of places. But in my opinion, Scotland is the last colony of the United Kingdom which will finally liberate itself. It's also probably the oldest colony, or at least one of the oldest colonies, because we've been trapped in this colony for 300 years and we have been given to believe that we couldn't leave it. But now we know that we can leave it. We simply need the United Nations to recognise the fact that we are a non-self-governing territory and that we fit all the criteria which are laid down by the UN when they're considering how to categorise a people. And in this case, we are a people. So that is vitally important. However, there is a threat to the UN, and there's a threat to Scotland's relationship with the United Nations, which comes in the form of Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage is riding high in the polls in England at the moment, not in Scotland. He's largely hoovered up a lot of the tiny amount of Tory voters in Scotland to his Reform Party, but he's made no secret of the fact that he wants to abolish the current international human rights legislation which is embedded in the United Kingdom's parliamentary legislation. And this is the thing which gives us things like the right to march and protest, the right to express our opinions freely, and the right to self-determination. All of these things are going to be at risk if Nigel Farage becomes the next Prime Minister of the UK, because he's going to abolish it. He wants to come up with a Nigel Farage version of human rights called the British Human Rights Bill, or the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights originally was written by England back at the same time when Scotland formulated its claim of right. And so this is a rewriting of a very, very old piece of legislation, which applies, incidentally, only to England anyway at the moment, and was superseded only by the UN Charter on Human Rights back in 1954. However, I digress. The point is that if Nigel Farage gets in England, then he's an existential threat to Scotland and its striving for independence. It's not going to be made possible if Farage gets in. He's definitely going to prevent us from having the right to self-determination. He's going to take it away, and he's going to replace it with something that he likes, the Farage Bill of Rights, and it will be things that he approves of, not anything that the United Nations approves of. And that will include shutting out anybody that he doesn't like from entering the UK in the first place. And by the UK, incidentally, he means England. So the whole idea of migration, both positive and negative, is going to be shut down by Farage and his very far right racist kind of politics, the politics of division and isolationism. And that is something Scotland can ill afford, especially at a time when it's planning to free itself, to liberate itself from English control. And the idea of freedom to march and demonstrate brings me to my final point today, which was a very successful march in Edinburgh by All Under One Banner. And I don't know about you, but I watched the full footage that was transmitted live by Independence Live yesterday during this march, and there seemed to be tens of thousands of people in that march. It was very difficult to count them all from the vantage point of a single camera, but by all accounts it was a massive and very noisy and good-natured demonstration. This is still essential because these types of events keep the issue of independence in the public eye. It's very difficult for the public to ignore the fact that there is a massive number of Scots who are demanding that we leave the Union immediately before Farage can do any more damage to us than has already been done. But a Farage English government would be a disaster for Scotland. We need the United Nations to keep Scotland within its charter and to keep our right to self-determination, no matter what Farage does. And to that end, actually, it's important for the Scottish Government, at the moment under Mr Swinney's tutelage or guidance, to adopt the United Nations Charter fully and the international human rights that it confers on us, and make sure that those human rights, those universal human rights, are adopted into Scots law, even before we go for independence, because we need to protect our ability to exercise our right to self-determination before we exercise it. And Farage coming into office in England would be a colossal disaster for that. And so some action must be taken by the SNP government if that is to be protected. Now that brings me to some positivity about the SNP, and that is that it is projected by all the polling companies at the moment to win an outright majority of seats in Holyrood next year. Now, despite my complaints about the way the SNP is run, this is very good news, because if the SNP wins an outright majority, it does not need to go into coalition with any British parties of any sort, Labour, Lib Dems or anyone else, and even the Green Party would not necessarily have to be approached if the SNP wins an outright majority, because they would then have the right to lead the country in their own inimitable way. The question in my mind really is whether it will be John Swinney who leads the party after such a sweeping victory. I don't know, maybe he will, maybe he won't, but many of us who still criticise the SNP for its lack of action towards independence will still vote for the SNP to ensure that the unionist parties do not get in via the back door. But it's also important, since we are now being led to believe by the polls that the SNP will win an outright majority, to use our second votes, not for the SNP, but for other pro-independence parties, because that will add to that outright majority of independence supporting MSPs. And the more we have, the bigger the majority in the Parliament for independence. And that is a critical thing. For even though some of the smaller parties will continue to criticise the SNP and its so far lack of action towards gaining independence, that will allow some pressure to be brought by friendly parties, not enemies, political enemies, but by political allies in the Scottish Parliament, to do something, and to do something quickly so that we can achieve that independence before Farage gets anywhere near number 10 Downing Street, because I think that is going to be vital. A Farage-led England would be a catastrophe for Scotland, and it's something that we must avoid at all costs. So the future is looking much, much more optimistic. The marching season got off to an amazingly good start, or middle, or near the end, because we're obviously coming into the autumn season now. But that was a very successful All Under One Banner march yesterday by anybody's measure. And if we can sustain and build upon that through the winter months and into next year, that is going to be another great supporting effort for our bid to take over our own parliament and make sure that it has a pro-independence majority government, and one which does not need to rely on coalitions anymore. Coalition governments are always weakened by the demands of those smaller parties. But I think in this case, that's not going to be a problem. And I hope it's not going to be a problem in the future at all. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today. I never really got the chance to articulate terribly much of this during Friday's Hod Majakit programme due to the problems we had with transmission. But I hope those of you who've watched this show this far will agree that this is a vital time for us. And if the SNP wins this outright majority next year, then we have the ability to do what we need to do to gain our independence before Farage can take control of Scotland. That's it from Inde-Car today. I hope you'll tune in again when I come on the air at some other random time this week. But in the meantime, as I always say, keep the faith. Remember, things are looking up. They're not getting worse, they're getting better for us. And that's the first time I've been able to say that for many, many months. Anyway, I'll see you soon. Bye for now.